In this game, Bobby Fischer grabbed the initiative in the opening and kept developing it, increasing the pressure on his opponent's position with every move. And when it seemed that Korchnoi defended against the immediate threats, Fischer carried out a brilliant maneuver, transforming his passive knight into a monster piece. Eventually, the knight sacrificed itself to demolish the enemy kingside, after which Korchnoi had to resign. Korchnoi started with d4 and Fischer played the King's Indian defense. Knight c3, bishop g7, e4, d6, bishop e2, short castle, knight f3, e5, short castle, knight c6, provoking white to play d5, and knight e7. And now that the center is closed, the plans of the sides are obvious. Black is going to move the knight in order to unblock the f-pawn and start the attack on the king side by playing f5. While white, of course, is going to play on the queen side. And white has a couple of possible options. Either immediate b4 in order to prepare c5, or knight e1 followed by knight d3, and from d3 the knight will also support the advance of the c-pawn, or what Korchnoi did. Knight d2. Moving the knight from f3, Korchnoi on the one hand took under control the h5 square, preventing the black knight from jumping to h5, which could have been quite unpleasant because the knight could have jumped to f4. And of course, on the other hand, the knight is moving to the queen side, and the knight can jump either to b3 later in the game or to c4, after white moves the c-pawn, of course. And Fischer decided to blockade the queen side. He played c5. So, before starting his active play on the king side, he tries to take some preventive measures on the king side. On the queen side. Now, for Korchnoi, it wouldn't be so easy to play b4. At the moment it doesn't work, of course, because the c-pawn takes the b4 square under control. However, the c5 advance has its drawback too. When the pawn was on c7, it defended the d6 pawn. And now that the pawn is on c5, the d6 pawn is weak. Korchnoi plays a3, so of course he's going to play b4. And Fischer does the same. He prepares his own advance on the king side. f5, so unblocking the f-pawn. And b4, Korchnoi starts his advance first. And he has created an immediate threat, namely capture on c5, after which black will be forced to capture with a d-pawn, and that would be, of course, in white's favor, because white would get the protected passed pawn on d5. That's why, in order to maintain the blockade on the queen side, Fischer plays b6. Now, in case white captures, black will capture with the b-pawn, of course. And white played rook b1, so white is going to open the files on the queen side, open the b file, and after that the rook will be placed on b1 very well. And Fischer starts his own attack on the king side, f5. And here Korchnoi made a passive move. f3. It wasn't necessary at all. Instead, it would have been much more logical and energetic to continue his pawn advance on the queen side. a4 would have been much stronger, but Korchnoi plays f3. And Fischer continues his energetic play, f4. Now he is going to move his g-pawn. And Korchnoi continues his pawn storm on the queen side, a4, g5, a5. So white is going to open the files on the queen side and then try to invade black's queen side with his pieces. And Fischer makes a strong move. Rook f6, the rook lift, very effective one. The rook will move to g6 in order to support the advance of the g-pawn. And if needed, the rook can also move to h6, attacking the h2 pawn. And here Korchnoi made a serious mistake. He captured on c5. Instead, it would have been much better to play queen b3. And after knight g6, for example, in order to move the piece closer to white king, white could have exchanged the pawns, and after the mass exchanges, the files would be open and the white queen could have invaded black's queen side. And in case the queens are exchanged, the black's attack on the king side wouldn't be so dangerous, and black's the weakness of the d6 pawn might tell. So the arising endgame, in the endgame, white would have a slight advantage. But instead of this, instead of queen b3, Korchnoi captures on c5. And it turns out that after b takes c, it isn't clear how white is going to develop his initiative on the queen side. While for black, it will be very easy. Just by making natural moves, black will increase his initiative and increase the pressure on white's king and kingside. Knight b3. So Korchnoi still hopes to invade black's queenside. And rook g6, of course, preparing g4, which at the moment doesn't work because white has the control over the g4 square. But after bishop d2 and knight f6, another black piece, the knight, takes under control the g4 square, besides the bishop and the rook. And it turns out that now black is ready to play g4. And anticipating g4, Korchnoi moves his king from the g-file, because after g4, most probably, the g-file will open. And, of course, g4 followed. Immediately, Fischer plays very energetically. And he has created an immediate threat, g3, which will be very unpleasant. It will be actually deadly. After this, white will be forced to play h3, in order to trying to hold the position, but it turns out that after h3, white wanted to keep the files closed, but black has a standard sacrifice, bishop takes h3. Either immediately, because after g takes h, the pawn from g3 will move to g2 with a fork, capturing the rook next move, or probably even stronger, preparing the sacrifice by playing rook h6 first, increasing the pressure on h3 pawn, and only then sacrificing on h3. That's why, in order to prevent black from playing g3, white had to capture the pawn. But now the knight is very strong. It is attacking h2, and black will increase the pressure on h2, and the knight might also jump on e3 or f2. And Korchnoi plays rook f3. His idea is to kick the knight out from g4, because on g4 it's very strong, by playing h3, attacking the knight. But after white plays h3, the pawn on h3 will be a weakness. It will become the target of attack of the black pieces. The bishop will attack it, the rook can join the attack of this pawn. That's why, by playing rook f3, Korchnoi defends his h3 pawn. Rook h6 followed. Now, of course, black is threatening to immediately capture the pawn. That's why h3 followed. But at the moment, white cannot capture the knight because the pawn is pinned. That's why Fischer has time to move his knight closer to the king side. And now knight h4 is a threat. That would be very unpleasant, attacking the rook. That's why first Korchnoi plays king g1, moving away the king from the h-file, unpinning his h-pawn, threatening to capture the knight. That's why Fischer doesn't have time to play knight h4. He needs to retreat his knight. And now, again, knight h4 is a serious threat. That's why Korchnoi plays bishop e1, taking under control the h4 square. Black still could have played knight h4, which would have led to the exchange of the bishop for the knight on h4, and black's position still would be better. However, Fischer found something much more sophisticated. I will give you a tip before pausing the video. Find a square from which the knight can join the attack of the h3 pawn. That's white's main weakness, and it is attacked already 2 times by the bishop and the rook, but that isn't enough. And so find the square from which the g6 knight will join the attack, and then find a very original and at first sight a paradoxical move by which Fischer starts his maneuver and the knight reaches that square. So the square is, of course, g5. That's easy. From g5 the knight will attack the h3 pawn. But how to reach that square? So in order to join the attack, the knight first must retreat. The only way to g5 is through h8. So first the knight moves to the worst square on the board, right on the corner. But that's the only way to move, to be rerouted to g5 through f7 to g5. Just in 2 moves, the knight will jump on g5 with great effect and with tempo, attacking the rook, and also the pawn. And anticipating knight g5, which will attack the rook, Korchnoi in advance moves away his rook d3. Knight f7, of course, followed, and bishop f3. Korchnoi tries to hold this position, but his position is already hopeless. Knight g5. And as you see, most white pieces are placed on the queen side, and black has a lot of pieces on the king side which attack the king side. So that means white simply doesn't have a defense. Queen e2 and rook g6, creating an immediate threat. Knight takes h3 check, after which white won't be able to capture with the g-pawn because it will be pinned. That's why Korchnoi moves away from the g-file. But now, of course, knight takes h3 comes with great effect. G takes h and bishop takes h3 check. King f2 and knight g4 check. By moving the knight from f6, Fischer opens his queen's way to h4, and that will come with great effect. White must capture the knight, and after bishop takes g4, it turns out that black has created two threats. The queen is under attack, and queen h4 check is threatened. In case white moves the queen, black will play queen h4 check, and the white king will be checkmated in a few moves. That's why Korchnoi resigned. And now I recommend watching a game in which Aaron Nemcovich carried out one of the greatest and most original knight maneuvers in chess history. But first, like this video and subscribe, as it's really helpful for the channel growth.